Good afternoon and welcome to Griffith Observatory and to our celebration of Apollo 9. How many of you came up here just today to come to this? That's it, really? Oh yeah, me too. Me too. So thank you for that. We're very, very happy that you're here. As you can see, well, I guess I should start by introducing us. I'm Dr. Laura Danley. I'm the curator of Griffith Observatory. To my left is Dr. David Reitzel. He's the astronomical lecturer. We have Patrick So, the astronomical theater programs manager, and Tony Cook, the astronomical observer. And in fact, if you ever come here on the first Friday of the month, the four of us are always on this stage at 7:30 on the first Friday of the month for All Space Considered. How many of you ever been to All Space Considered? Well, you're just going to have to come back on the first Friday of the month and see the show. You know, we're streaming this, so hello, live stream audience, welcome. And you should come to Los Angeles. If you're not in Los Angeles, come to Griffith Observatory, come to All Space Considered, and join us for all the wonderful programming that is made possible by you, the tax-paying citizens of Los Angeles. I don't know if you know this, but Griffith Observatory is owned and operated by the city of Los Angeles. How many of you are taxpayers? Yay, taxpayers! We love your tax dollars. We're very grateful. And are there any members of Friends of the Observatory in the audience? Yay! Everyone needs to thank this gentleman on the way out because
There's two or three.
Oh, I didn't. You know, these lights are really bright. Who else? Let me see the other. Oh, some other people. Those gentlemen, that gentleman too, a couple others. If you, because Friends of the Observatory is our sister 501c3 membership and charitable organization, allows you to contribute, and they in turn contribute to Griffith Observatory. For example, sponsoring our 5th grade school field trip program, and we know you love 5th graders and want them to come up to Griffith Observatory. So for all the things that Friends of the Observatory does, we hope you will consider becoming a member, or at least dropping a dollar in the little bucket out there. You'll see a little place where you can put a little dollar or two in and thank our support organization. So with all that intro underway, let me get to the business of today. Today is March 3rd, and we're going to do 2 programs, each of them about a half an hour. Rather than have, it's a nice day, I'm sure many of you just happened here, so we don't want to keep you in here for an hour. This will be about a 25-minute program. Then you can get back to fooling around in the observatory, seeing all the wonderful things that are there. And then we're going to do another one with a little bit of a different focus at 2 o'clock. So if you are here to hear more about Apollo 9, you'll want to come to both of them. Okay. Why today? Well, because 50 years ago today, as you can see from that patch on the upper left, Apollo 9 was launched into orbit around Earth. This is the 50th anniversary. And in fact, if you look at all of the Apollo missions, we're going to be celebrating these all this year and next year and the following year, celebrating each and every Apollo mission on its 50th anniversary. I think I'm not even going to ask you how many of you remember it, because then you'd have to, give your age. But yeah, yeah. Oh, yes. And so it's hard to fathom that it was 50 years ago, but it was. So that's why we're here today to celebrate that and share a little bit about the missions with you. So 50 years ago today, this happened.
Each piece checked out before launch.
Computer monitors, 20 seconds. Guidance release, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. Commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
We need bigger woofers. Has any of you seen an Apollo launch, an actual launch of an Apollo mission? Real? What was the sound like?
Apollo 9, you go all the way. Everything looks good. Roger.
It was, you could feel it in your
5
body.
minutes, everybody's happy as a clam here. Looking.
Happy as a clam on their way to Apollo 9. So Apollo 9 was part of a series of missions, all part of the Apollo program, and each and every mission had a different specific purpose. So if you have been here last time, what was going on in 1969? This was going on in 1969. Did you have clothes like that? Yeah, I'm afraid most of us did. This is what we all looked like, all of us, except for the guys in mission control with the white shirts and the skinny black ties. But this was kind of culturally what was going on in 1969. But of course, it was a very difficult time because it wasn't just all groovy fun. It was a very difficult time because we were in the midst of a very terrible war in Vietnam. And 1968, the year before, had been a particularly difficult year with the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, violent protests in the street. The Tet Offensive was in January of 1968. But the end of 1968 had a glorious finish with Apollo 8. And we celebrated that last December. If you are interested, go to our YouTube channel and see our stories around the mission of Apollo 8. But this, of course, is about Apollo 9. So now it's January, February, and finally March of 1969. The Vietnam War is still raging. The bombing of Cambodia commenced in March of 1969. But there were a couple other things, just to remind you. First of all, only about 4.5 billion people. I liked average monthly rent, $135. That's pretty good. Average cost of a house, $15,000. Average annual income, $8,000. So, you know, kind of went both ways. And of course, a lot of other things going on culturally, Manson murders. Nixon was inaugurated as president. The Chappaquiddick Incident. A 747 debuted in 1969, kind of fun to think about. The first ATM was in 1969. You might not have known that. The Concorde. And of course, culturally, in fact, all of the songs coming in were the top 6 songs. There were 6 songs in that playlist, and we did them in reverse order. The top 6 songs of this week in March 1969. So Sly and the Family Stone, Everyday People, that last one was the #1 song. So it was quite a dynamic time culturally. Lots going on. A lot of, the contrast between the world of the groovy 1969 Summer of Love and the earlier part of the decade was strong. So with that, we head into the launch of Apollo 9. And it had a very particular purpose. So Patrick, you want to tell us about the real goal, the big goal of Apollo 9?
Yes, indeed. The main mission of the Apollo 9 was to test this strange-looking vehicle, which is the Lunar Module, and it's a familiar shape to those of us who saw the moon landings, and of course you saw footage of the moon landings. This image here was taken in at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. It's a Lunar Module 2, and it's a vehicle that literally was designed for the space environment and to take astronauts directly to the surface of the moon. So how did this vehicle, how was it developed? How did it come about? Well, we have to turn the clock back to 1960, in fact, early 1960s, when people were thinking about how to get to the moon. And there were different competing ideas, and there was a direct way to go to the moon on the left there. And there was also an Earth orbit rendezvous where there'll be 2 launches, and then there'll be a vehicle that would land directly on the moon, and then there will be another vehicle that would fuel it. And then there was a lunar orbit rendezvous, which would mean 2 spacecraft and a lunar land, basically a lunar lander, a spacecraft, and the spacecraft would basically orbit the moon, and then a lander will land on the moon, and then ascend, and then rendezvous with the spacecraft.
What do you mean by rendezvous?
Rendezvous is when the lunar lander lands on the moon, and then it blasts off from the moon, and then connects up with the command module.
It has a hookup with the command module.
Yeah.
And hopefully in all 3 of those scenarios, they come home too.
Right.
Yeah.
So the most popular idea of getting to the moon at the time was the direct method, which involved designing kind of rockets that might look like this. And the main proponent of the direct landing was Wernher von Braun, who favored big, giant rockets. And he worked at Marshall Space Flight Center and at NASA. And then there was his rival who proposed the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, which was John Hubbard of NASA Langley. Now, the problem with the direct landing was involved a huge rocket, lots of fuel, and it was just basically too expensive. And at that time, NASA was had a certain budget, and they simply couldn't afford it, and there was no other way they could actually think of getting to the moon except for John Hubbard's idea of a lunar rendezvous. So, in fact, John Hubbard actually put his career on the line because his idea wasn't as much favored as Wernher von Braun's, and wrote to the director of NASA and said, if you want to go to the moon, you got to use my idea. This is the only way to get to the moon, and if it wasn't for him, the Apollo program would never have happened, and we wouldn't have gotten people on the moon. So his
That's
idea.
not a name you hear a lot, as much as you hear Wernher von Braun. Everybody's heard of Wernher von Braun.
Right.
I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was basically the unsung hero of the Apollo mission, and basically, his idea was exactly as described earlier: take a command module and a lunar lander, circle both around the moon. The lunar lander separates, goes down to the moon, and then the mission begins on the moon. And then this portion of the lunar lander blasts off from the moon and then connects up with the command module, and then they go home. So the idea was very simple, and then the competition began from NASA to contract a firm to build the lunar lander. And in fact, NASA invited 11 firms, and only 9 responded. And they came up with elaborate ideas like this, with different kind of basic models, and even a full-blown mock-up of a lunar lander. And of all the 9 contractors they looked at, they chose this. Kind
How
of
sophisticated.
unassuming concept for the lunar lander, which was they actually chose Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation to build the lunar lander. So they presented NASA with this, and basically it has an ascent section, so kind of wood there, made of wood, and a descent section with 5 landing legs.
Made of paper clips.
Yeah, it looks like paper clips. So
I'm sure there was some paperwork that
Yeah.
came with that.
yeah. Well,
Right. Here, give me a few $1 million or a few $1
Right.
billion.
right. So someone came up with that really fast, and NASA liked it. So above all the other models. So they further developed this, and like all good aerospace companies, they made a concept model, a proposal for NASA. And this is the first concept of the lunar module. It had 4 large windows and a little dome window on the side, which was basically modeled after, like the front of a helicopter where the astronauts had full visibility. There were 2 round docking hatches, one forward, as you see, which is right here, and one at the top. And it still had its 5 landing legs. Now, they soon realized that this lunar module, with all the calculations, was far too heavy, and they had to find ways of reducing the weight of this lunar module. Because basically, on the calculations, every pound of weight on the lunar module means that you have to carry 4 pounds of fuel. So first thing they did was they took away those 4 windows and just made 2 windows. And the big docking hatch in front was made smaller and was not a docking hatch anymore. It was just an exit and kind of a doorway to the moon, basically. It was a little door there. And then they took away one of the landing legs, and so there were 4. So that was a great weight reduction. Now, there were further weight reductions. The original concept had 2 seats for the astronauts. They realized that, well, we don't need seats because we're in a weightless environment, and the moon has 1/6 of the gravity of Earth. So the astronauts can stand and then use the controls and then land on the moon. They started building a production models so that they could do ground testing. So on the left, you can see an astronaut with a backpack, and the problem with the backpack was it was rectangular, but the hatch was round, and they found that the astronauts had difficulty getting in and out of the hatch, and basically it was kind of like a variation on a square peg in a round hole, because of the backpack kept getting caught in the hatch. So they made the hatch square. The other thing they did was that on the lunar module there's a ladder, but in fact in the earlier versions they didn't have a ladder. They said, well, you know what? The astronauts can just climb down on a knotted rope, which you can see right there. And so with the ground test, they found it was kind of hard, and also it was also dangerous too, because they could actually rip their suits doing that. So they decided, okay, with all the weight reductions, we can afford to put a ladder on one of the landing legs below the platform. The engines were also selected and engineered very carefully. The two large engines here, these are kind of different variations. These were for the descent stage, which carried the ascent and the descent stage down to the moon. And then the ascent stage was a smaller engine, because all it needed was just lift this upper stage, the ascent stage, back into orbit to rendezvous with the command module. Now, the fuel that they needed for this was a very corrosive fuel, so corrosive that once the engines were fired, they could be never fired again, because the fuel was kind of a mixture of nitric acid and something called Aerosine 50, and when mixed together, formed a very corrosive mixture which would corrode the lines and all the fittings. So every lunar module that was launched into space had never had fired engines. So the engines had to be engineered to not be to fire 100% of the time, not 99.9% of the time, because there was no option of not firing in space.
There's also something special about the descent engine that was unique, you know?
Yes, that was, this was the first engine that had a variable thrust, so you can throttle up, throttle down, so the lunar module can hover, you know, kind of low, and if there's obstacles, they can thrust up and then avoid obstacles on the moon. So that was a very special engine, which had not been made, and it was made for the first time. So,
and of course, their lives depended on it. I know that's obvious, but when you really think about these engines, that's the rest of it's candy. The engines are the thing that are going to get you there and get you home.
But to me, Kennedy's called they had the whole 7 years to do this, right? So
yeah, I mean, they didn't have a backup engine. It was just a single engine on each of the modules. So here's the kind of summary of the development, and you can see the third lunar module has a square hatch, and they refined it so that basically all the propulsion tanks, they just had enough material to kind of wrap around all the propulsion tanks and all the other electronics, and to increase the weight savings until the final model, which was much smaller than the original version, came out in late '69. So here's another view of it, and with that, they actually were ready for flight testing. And the first lunar module they built was Lunar Module 1, LM1, and it was launched on Apollo 5, an uncrewed mission. It didn't have any landing legs, as you can see there, but the purpose of the mission was to fire those engines, so the ascent engine and the descent engine while it was in space. The mission was successful, and they got some good engineering data on that. Basically, they fired it long enough to simulate a moon mission. So the descent engine was first fired at 10%, and then it went up to 100% for a few minutes, which was kind of like the length of time they needed to descend on the moon, and it didn't cut out at all, so that was really great.
no crew on that one, right?
And there was no crew on that, yeah. So that was a bare bones test for the engines. And then we kind of skipped Lunar Module 2. Well, Lunar Module 2 was a backup to Lunar Module 1 in case Lunar Module 1 failed. And that, of course, ended up in the Smithsonian Museum. But it was also used for ground test. But the story about Lunar Module 3 was it was originally intended for Apollo 8's mission. but it wasn't ready. When it was delivered to NASA, it had over 100 fuel leaks, so they had to delay that to the Apollo 9 mission, and on the Apollo 9 mission, it was going to be flight tested in Earth's orbit.
Before you go to the next one, I just want to point out the time scale here. We're looking at March 1969. We landed people on the moon, and we had to do it by the end of the decade in July of 1969. So, this is not a lot of time. And it's December 1968, the moon landing's 7 months away, and 100 fuel leaks. I mean, the way in which things were done 50 years ago is very different than the way they are today.
How many of you remember space shuttle flights?
Oh.
Okay, now the first viable replacement that can carry crews from the United States back into space was only tested this week.
Yeah, this morning really.
Yeah, and this morning it successfully docked the uncrewed Dragon.
Takes a lot of time to develop now, but this was on a real fast track. Anyway, go ahead, Patrick.
Okay, so this is Lunar Module 3, and this was ready, prepared for flight for Apollo 9. And we'll talk a little bit more about the mission, but this is what it looked like after it was launched in the third stage of the Apollo Saturn V. And just kind of summarize, it took 7 years to make all the lunar modules, and it involved 8,000 personnel at Grumman Aircraft Company. So at a cost of, in today's dollars, of $22.34 billion in 2019 dollars.
Great. Now, there's another part of the story that we're going to tell you in the next program, which is really about the navigation. Here we have Apollo astronauts and the director of Griffith Observatory looking at something that you can look at right outside this door.
Actually, that's an older version.
Oh, it's an
Just
older
before
version.
we knew
Yeah.
what the backside of the moon looked
Well,
like.
that's true. But here at Griffith Observatory. So
And
that
that's,
we're going to talk about in the second half.
Right,
so we're
but
just
that's
going
two of the crew
keep.
members.
We're going to
from
keep
Apollo 9.
moving.
Yeah.
So here they are learning how to navigate, and we're going to tell you all about that starting at 2 o'clock. But because in the interest of time, we're going to zip into the Apollo 9 story.
Okay, of which again today's the 50th anniversary of the launch up. So we can go on ahead. Here's the crew on the. Let me use this for a second. We have James McDivitt, who was astronaut already, who had been in space on Gemini 4, the second Gemini flight. David Scott, who had been on Gemini 8. Now, how many of you have seen First Man? Okay, Gemini 8 is the mission where they did the first docking in space, and immediately it tumbled out of control, and they almost lost their crew. So Neil Armstrong was Dave Scott's crewmate on that one. So he had been on one of the most hazardous missions ever. The rookie was Rusty Schweickart. All of these were Air Force people. Dave Scott, James McDivitt was a brigadier general in the Air Force, so pretty high-ranking folks. They named their spacecraft based on their impressions of them as they came to Downey, California, and saw them being built. The command and service module, the part that would carry them back to Earth from the moon eventually, it was known as Gumdrop because of the blue plastic covering over the factory, fresh from the factory spacecraft. And the Lunar Module was called Spider. And I don't think you need much imagination to see why. The Saturn V that would launch it, this was the fourth time people would, actually the fourth time a Saturn V was launched and the second time people would ride on it. Magnificent thing, 363 feet tall, which is just a little bit shorter than our city hall in Los Angeles. Now, one of the incidents happened when the crew was getting in. This is Gunter Wendt. If you've seen like The Right Stuff or any of those, they always have the joke, I wonder if they're Gunter Wendt whenever the crew came in. That's because he tucked in most people who flew in spacecraft up until the space shuttle. And the thing is, when the crew got in, he would take his foot against the seat, their seat, and then pull the straps to make sure the astronauts were as tight in the capsule as they could be, so they wouldn't be thrown around during the launch. So on this particular launch, and let's go ahead and we'll see the launch. The launch went very smoothly, and the astronauts said, you know, we're not really bouncing around that much. And Jim McDivitt and Rusty Schweickart were bashed up so close to each other that they couldn't really move their arms. So Rusty said, well, you know, as soon as they saw Gunter wasn't looking through the window, they loosened the strap a little bit so he'd have a little bit of room. And they go, yeah, this flight's not so bad. But when it came to the staging, I think we may have, oh, okay. When it came to the staging, where the stages started coming off, it was a huge jolt, and both those two astronauts that had loosened their straps almost ended up in the control panel. So they made a note for future missions, don't alter what Gunter Wendt does. He knows what he's doing. And he got a scolding from Dave Scott, who was the commander. Now, early in the mission, here, there aren't really any pictures of the crew in the capsule. There's some movies that we don't have, but here's Rusty Schweickart and Jim McDivitt, and we go ahead here. What they did, they used the command module to separate from the upper stage. It's called an S4B. Tucked in it was the lunar module, as Patrick has explained, and they pulled this out of the S4B stage. Then, and here we see what it looks like when it's docked. Now, if you saw the docking this morning of the Dragon and the SpaceX, and the International Space Station, you saw something very similar to this. It's a docking target, and people line it up and go in. Then they, from their computer on board the Apollo command module, reactivated this upper stage of the Saturn and actually sent it into orbit. This thing is still orbiting the sun, just slightly outside of the Earth's orbit. So, and that's it, zooming off into space. And now, they actually did some tests where they got in the lunar module, made sure it worked, and during that process, suddenly Rusty Schweickart wasn't feeling so well. And actually, if you read the transcripts of the first day, he's always being asked second times to give readings on computers and stuff, and it's like he isn't quite all there. And all of a sudden, he just lost his, lunch, we'll say, and got really sick. It had happened once before on Apollo 8, but it wasn't reported because, real pilots don't throw up in spacecraft. Well, he got pretty ill, and he had actually tried not to. The theory was if you didn't move your head around and stuff like that and look straight ahead, you wouldn't get sick. The problem is if you do that, if you ever fly in space, I can say that now without laughing too much, you actually want to get sick as quick as you can because that means you're adapting. And what they didn't know is until the third day of this mission, Schweickart had been trying to hold it together and suddenly just lost it and got really sick. And then he kept getting sick all that day. And that was pretty serious because the rest of this mission depended on him not only walking in space, but also flying the lunar module for the first time. And if they couldn't do that, the mission really was lost. On the fourth day of the mission, Dave Scott and I are kind of talking about, how they're sorry they can't do this mission. And all of a sudden, Schweickart starts joking and stuff. And he said, hey, Scott says, I think you're feeling better, right? He goes, yeah, I'm feeling pretty good. I said, you want to do the mission? Yeah, I want to do the mission. And he was fine after that. So their first special thing they did was for Schweickart in the lunar module to get out of the lunar module through the door that they would eventually, on later missions, descend to the moon's surface. And he would stand on the porch and test out the moonwalking suit, because that hadn't been tested. A lot of first things on this mission. Dave Scott was in the command module taking pictures and movies of Schweickart. Now, a couple days later, the Schweickart and McDivitt got in the lunar module and flew it about 100 miles from the command module. And here we see the beginning of their maneuvers, the checkout. You'll see these things dangling from the feet. These are contact probes. So in Apollo 11, when you hear contact, that's when those touch the moon and shut off the engine. What they found on this mission was that fourth one was redundant, so more weight to cut. And actually, this lunar module, by the way, was still way too heavy to send to the moon. So there was still a lot of work to do on the lunar module, which wouldn't be complete until Apollo 11. After they flew out 100 miles and tested all the things they could imagine doing with the engine that would land them on the moon, they then separated and left the descent stage, as it's called, stranded in space, and flew the Ascent stage, the crew cabin part, back to the lunar module. I mean, sorry, to the command module.
Yeah.
And here we see it. And here's the return of that Ascent stage. And finally, the astronauts had a camera running as they returned to Earth after 10 days in space. They hit the atmosphere at about, this one was not a lunar mission, so it hit the atmosphere at only 18,000 miles per hour, and then rode its parachutes down and made it safely back to Earth after tremendous accomplishment.
Yeah, and again, with 4 months to go before the mission. So that really had to go if we were going to stay on schedule.
Yep.
So lastly, and I know we're running a little long, how many of you have heard that some people believe that the Apollo mission is fake? So if you have friends that say that, I want you to listen to what Dr. Reitzel has to say so that we can dispel them of that completely incorrect idea.
Or is it incorrect? Because I'll tell you, Apollo 9 never went to the moon. Didn't. It was only in orbit. But Apollo 8 went there in orbit, and the others did. A lot of people think this is how we faked the surface missions. Doge was involved. Very, very lunar. So landing. But we built equipment. You saw it launched earlier. We built these gumball command modules. We built the lander like you just heard about. But also, all those people were looking at real data. All these engineers had to be faked out, so they had to fake all the data on all those monitors as well. So people don't think about what it would be like to fake a mission. You aren't just faking a few photographs, a few video clips. You have to fake everything these people saw because all of them thought they were going to the moon, or they were in on it. Of course, the launches all had to be, well, they were real. People saw them go up into space, so they made real hardware that went to space, so they didn't fake that part. There was stuff that had to happen to get to the moon that amateurs were able to see through telescopes. So they actually had to build the hardware that faked what it would have looked like to go to the moon so the amateurs could photograph it and report that it looked like we were going to the moon. So all this is stuff that was done by non-NASA people, non-United States people. These are international observers. The equipment would behave like this. It would blow off those panels. Here's a shot from the ground. Again, amateurs taking this picture. Those 4 panels coming off in the main command module. They had to build a lot of sets, a lot of gray dirt. The sets look different. Now you might have paintings in the background, but the foreground stuff would all have to be a giant set. Where's all the gray dirt? Where's the person that had the dump truck with all that dirt in it? That person would probably spill their beans for a couple thousand. I trucked it from Mojave to wherever. Now, people often want to know, why aren't there stars in this picture? That's an idea of this must have been fake. They forgot to put stars in it. Well, there's a reason. Photography just can't capture really dark and really bright stuff. So here's a shot of the observatory, and here it is a little brighter, and here it is overexposed. So you can see that, you can see the detail in the top part of the observatory here, but if I back up to, it's completely black. Yet the clouds in the sky look kind of nice. Kind of a happy medium here, but even still the cloud on the far left is overexposed. So trying to get really faint stuff and really bright stuff all at once isn't easy. Here's the shot, the famous Earthrise shot from Apollo 8. No stars in the photo. Well, why? Well, let's take a look at this little video. We're gathering photons, and if we pause partway through, you can see it gets brighter, brighter, brighter. Well, when you see the stars, the rest of the stuff's completely washed out. That's no good. You can either have the foreground and Earth look good, or you can have stars. We didn't go all the way to the moon to get a picture of stars. You can see those from here on Earth. We went to get this picture. We left equipment on the moon that makes measurements. And in fact, this is a piece of little equipment here. Actually, this one's about the shadows. Sorry, I'm trying to rush too much. The shadows here are going different directions. You can see the shadows, those going that way. These seem to be going left, right. Must have had multiple light sources. It was faked with big spotlights. Well, here's a shot I took walking up to the observatory. These shadows are going different directions. It's called perspective. Again, it was figured out in the Renaissance by artists. This also, shadows look like they're going different directions. It's both perspective and relief. The ground is going a different direction. If you have height differences, shadows do weird things. This is the instrument that was left on the ground that still works. If you bounce a laser beam off this, the laser beam comes back to Earth. If you don't hit the right spot on the moon, right where we said the astronauts left these, you don't get a return signal. It doesn't come back. So you have to hit the spots where we said we went. We brought back moon rocks. We gave out a lot of pounds internationally. Nobody ever came back and said these didn't come from the moon. The Soviets also brought back moon rocks from their landers. They were robotic missions, and those moon rocks are the same, basically look like the moon rocks we brought back. They would have an interest to say we didn't go. They have not said that. These moon rocks also have these little tiny micrometeorite impacts on them. You don't get those on Earth rocks because our atmosphere burns up the little pebbles as they come in. These little glass spherules, they form when impacts happen on the moon. You get them on Earth, but they erode quickly. They are everywhere on the moon because there's no erosion. So we see those, and this even has a little impact on it as well, so kind of cool. We sent a telescope to orbit the moon called Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, and it's actually got shots of the moon landings. Now, this was built by NASA, so maybe you don't believe this part, but we can see the equipment left behind. You'd need a telescope about a mile wide in orbit in order to get these sorts of pictures, or you can send a 12-inch telescope to the moon. So that's what we did and got these photographs, and you can even see the trails that the astronauts left behind as they walked. And let's label some stuff here. There's the descent stage. The rover is over here, lunar rover tracks all over the place. So it really looks to me like we went to the moon. People want to know why we haven't been back. Well, here's why. Here's the federal budget, percent of the federal budget that NASA got. 58, very small, as we planned and started to execute the lunar landings. It went above 4%. As the lunar landings happened, that budget dropped down again. Apollo ends, and look, it's below 1% of the federal budget all the way across. And if you're doing things like International Space Station and Space Shuttle, you don't have the money left behind to go back to the moon. It's expensive to do it. So it's a matter of political will and money to accomplish it. People think we can't do it. Well, we can. It just takes the will to do it. So I firmly believe that we did go to the moon. We left boot prints on the moon. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you go to the final slide, we want to invite you back at 2 o'clock if you want to hear about the navigation and more details. And come back any of those dates. We'll be here. We'll be talking about each and every mission, or you can look at it on our YouTube or even watch it live on our streaming pages. So thank you again for coming, and we'll be happy to answer questions after we end the program and end the stream. Okay, thank you. Okay, I just wanted to say, because some of you may want to be getting So we have about 1 minute before we start. But before we start, let me ask you this. How many of you remember those songs from the radio? Yeah, right. So every song you heard was that was the top 5 songs from 1969, the first week of March 1969. So, it's like we've just traveled back 50 years. So, okay, well, I think we'll just wait for these last folks to come in and then we'll get started. How many of you were here for the first talk? So thank you for coming back. I know we were very impressed that you had been at a launch. That's pretty amazing. I know, exactly. We are, I think, about ready. Why don't we let those folks take a seat and then we'll get started. Okay, I'll just get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming back to the second of our 2 talks at Griffith Observatory, celebrating the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the launch of Apollo 9. Before we get started, I just want to introduce, for those who were not here for the first talk, all of us. This is Dr. David Reitzel, astronomical lecturer. I'm Dr. Laura Danley. I'm the curator of Griffith Observatory. Patrick So is our theater programs manager. He manages the planetarium. If you haven't seen a planetarium show, you want to go see one of those today. And Tony Cook is our astronomical observer. And I would normally say make sure you stick around to dark so you can look through a telescope, but we've had so much rain, and we haven't had a lot of telescope viewing in this past 2 months. Will it ever stop? I don't know.
They tell me they need the rain, but I don't know what for.
Because California, we showed this on last Friday's All Space Considered. Our part of most of California is officially out of the drought. So I know this rain is not fun, but it's really great for us. Okay, so, and welcome also to our live stream audience. We're glad that you're back for part 2. And if you haven't, really? I am unmuted, I'm pretty sure.
I hear you're amplified.
Yeah, I'm amplified. Ooh, well, maybe I need to turn my head down, talk that way. Maybe I need to get my hair out of the way. That helps. Does that help? Can you hear me better? Yeah. Okay. We had 2 talks today. This is the second of 2, celebrating the Apollo missions. The Apollo missions, of course, were the missions that went to the moon. And that, if you look at the dates, that was 50 years ago. So it's kind of stunning, especially if you remember the Apollo missions, to think that that was a whole 50 years ago. So we will be giving talks and presentations on each one of these missions as they go along to celebrate. So stay tuned to our website or follow us on Twitter at All Space Considered, and you'll see announcements for the upcoming talks. But this, of course, is the 50th anniversary of Apollo 9. So we always like to start shows like this with a launch. So here we are 50 years ago today.
The countdown for the launch of Apollo 9 was underway. Each piece checked out before launch.
Computer monitors, 20 seconds. Guidance release, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. Commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
This does not compare to the experience of actually hearing it.
Happy as a clam here, looking.
So the launch was very successful. I asked at the last one, how many of you have heard or were physically present for an Apollo launch? And I know this woman was. It's an astonishing feeling. It's so powerful, so loud, everything is shaking from the vibration. So it's really quite a powerful thing. So, of course, this happened in 1969, and for those of you who remember those days, I'm sure you had groovy clothes like this. But not everything was groovy. The late 60s, of course, were marred by some very painful times. 68, the previous year, we had the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. The war in Vietnam was in full swing. There were terrible protests against the war and because of all the political goings on at the time. And in fact, by the January, February, and now March of 1969, the bombing of Cambodia began in March 1969. So it sort of gives you a sense of a very uneasy time in American history. Now, in December of the year before, we sent our first mission to the moon. That was Apollo 8. They didn't land, but they circled the moon. And those videos from that program last December are available on our YouTube channel. We encourage you to go see them. But just a few other things to remember about 1969. First of all, you could rent an apartment for $135. That's my favorite statistic from 1969. There were only about 4.5 billion people on the Earth at that time. And just a few other reminders. The Chappaquiddick Incident, the Charles Manson Incident took place that year. The first flight of a 747 was that year. Richard Nixon was inaugurated. The first ATM was in 1969. So that doesn't seem that long ago, but it was. And on a more cultural and fun front, of course, all the music you heard we talked about, The Godfather was published. And that big sea of people, of course, is the summer of 1969, Woodstock. So it was quite a dynamic time in American history, lots of Paisley, but that was the stage for the launch of Apollo 9. Now, in the first of these programs, we talked a fair bit about the Lunar Module. That was one of the main focuses of the program. But in today's program, we're going to focus a little bit more about the navigation, because when you think about it, we'd never had to navigate to another world before. Apollo 8 had done it. But Tony, you want to say a little bit more about this?
Sure.
I had been assigned the role
Oh,
of
this got
Lieutenant
a movie.
Okay,
So
well then we'll skip
just
over
go-
it.
Just skip over it. And basically, the idea of what the Apollo astronauts had to learn were the stars. They had to be able to recognize constellations, kind of like if you've been in Scouts or something and you have to find your way north by learning how to find the North Star and the Big Dipper and all that. Well, the constellations are just handy things in the sky, and they're patterns of stars. And if you learn their names and remember the stories that are supposed to go with them, you'll remember them when you see them. It's a way to become familiar. Well, the heart of the Apollo program was a computer that would guide the rocket. Now, there was radar and radio to keep track of where the rocket actually was. So the astronauts weren't navigating quite in the same sense that you navigate a ship. But they did have to know the angle of their rocket with respect to the stars and to the universe to know that when they fire it, it's going the right direction. I mean, that's probably the main thing they really had to pay attention to. So both the command, actually, if we can go back one, the command module, the part the 3 astronauts rode in, had a telescope under the seats of the astronauts. They could fold up one of the seats and get to the eyepieces and sight stars. And then when the right star appeared, the computer would point it at the star, and if it was actually centered, the astronaut would confirm that on the computer. If it wasn't, the astronaut would have to visually identify the correct star and then tell the computer, that's where you're supposed to be aimed. Then there's something called an inertial navigation system with whirling gyroscopes and stuff that would be aligned then with the universe, and they could proceed on with the flight. So this was done actually several times every day to make sure the inertial navigation was correct with the universe. The Lunar Module, the lander that would go to the moon, also had a similar system. Not quite as fancy, but you could still sight stars on it and know your orientation. Now, in 1966, Griffith Observatory got a contract with NASA to train Apollo astronauts. Now, in general, NASA had been sending astronauts to other planetariums to learn the sky, but mainly just for general knowledge. In this case with Apollo, they really depended on it to make the Apollo work. So if they didn't know constellations or needed a brush up or needed specific training for flights, they were here. So more than 20 of the, I think it's 26 astronauts who went to the moon were here. On September 26, 1966, we see the crew of Apollo 1 came here, and this was only a few months before they would perish in the horrible fire in January 67. Just a couple days later, the crew that we're talking about today were here. They were the backup crew to Apollo 1. But they would continue coming here for a couple more years until their flight. The Apollo 1 crew consisted of Virgil Ivan Grissom, Edward White II, and Roger Chaffee. And note the names. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. In fact, we'll see here. Now, the Apollo astronauts had to learn 37 key stars that were programmed into their computer. So without having to look at charts and figure, oh, is that star? So, no, they had to recognize it cold. And so the underline, or the big, large names here are the 37 stars. Notice one of them is Rhaegor. Rhaegor?
For most of you who don't know your stars, that's not a star that we know, right?
What's Rhaegor backwards? Roger, okay. And then up here in Cassiopeia, let's see, you see the word Navi. What's Navi backwards? Okay, and what did I tell you Gus Grissom's middle name was? Ivan. And finally, down, let's see, up in the Big Dipper, near the Big Dipper, there's a weird name, Dionysus. Second, right, so Edward White II. So somehow, during their training here, those three names appeared on the NASA charts and got programmed into the computers and then got picked up by other magazines and stuff, and they started appearing all over the world as names. I've been helping one of the Apollo 9 crew members, Dave Scott, try to reconstruct how the names were actually chosen here. One story is that it was a joke played by Gus Grissom and his crew because he announced to Clemons there were three new stars they had to learn, but those didn't have any names on them in the charts we've seen. And Dave Scott remembers after the Apollo 1 fire sitting down with the director of the observatory and trying to figure out some way that they could memorialize the astronauts who had been here on the Apollo 1 mission by turning names backwards. So one of those stories isn't right, and I couldn't tell you. And even now, after having talked with Dave Scott a little bit, it's still uncertain. We are trying to go back through the records and figure it out. Anyway, here we see a scene from Apollo 8, and here's Jim Lovell looking through the navigation telescope, and recognizing stars and confidently plugging it into the computer and flying around the moon. So this was a system that worked, and the astronauts did a lot of training here. Here we see the similar telescope in the Lunar Module. And so by the time Scott came here in 1967 to start training for his Apollo 9 flight, he was no longer backup for the first Apollo flight. Rusty Swikert, who was one of his crewmates, helped our shop staff come up with something that could be used in the planetarium that would help simulate what it was like being in the capsule. They had a certain telescope that had a mirror that could sweep around the sky connected to the computer, but it didn't have a very wide field. It's not like sitting in a planetarium where you can see the whole sky at once. You could only see kind of a narrow part of the sky. So they put a visor in front of the astronauts with a little hole that kind of represented the view that they'd get through their instrument. And then the astronauts would sit in this chair, and here's Dave Scott, the commander of Apollo 9, sitting in our chair, and with an auxiliary control that we used to use for putting in slides in our theater and aligning them with the planetarium. He would use that to move the sky around and go from one star to the other, kind of like maneuvering the spacecraft around. So other people from Apollo 9 are Jim McDivitt and Rusty Schweikert. Here with the director, Clarence Clemons. Is anybody here ever hear a lecture by Clarence Clemons? It's too bad. He knew the sky beautifully, and with a green arrow would take you from one star to another, and it would just embed itself in your mind. I came here around the same time as this, but I was only like 11 years old.
So you can see this chair today after the talk. Go
Yeah,
down to
you'll
the
see it in
depths
a
of
sec, yeah.
space. Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, and so anyway, this program with NASA lasted until 1970, and the last few crews had already been through it or didn't need it. But here's Clarence Clemons on his retirement in July 1969 with a signed photograph by the Apollo 8 crew in gratitude for what they learned to help get them to the moon. And I have picked this out of the trash long before the renovation of the building came. But this chair is the one that some of the greatest explorers in the world that people will probably be hearing about centuries from now actually sat in to learn their way to get to the moon using our planetarium theater.
And that chair is, if you, after the talk, go down to the depths of space, this is a picture of the exhibit that's there right now. So you can go see the astronaut chair right now.
It looks
Sit in the chair.
No.
It looks undistinguished. It's just a lawn chair, but and that's why it, before people knew what it was, it got hauled out. I literally pulled it out of the trash one time.
So obviously being able to navigate to the moon, absolutely critical. Also very critical to this mission was the ability to the Apollo 9 mission, was the ability to test something called the Lunar Module. And so Patrick, you want to say a few words about
Sure.
what that was?
Yeah, so back in the early 60s, people were thinking of ways to get to the moon, and there were three competing ideas. The direct, the Earth orbit rendezvous, and the lunar orbit rendezvous. The first two involved landing heavy spacecraft directly on the moon, but the third one involved sending a spacecraft with a lunar lander and having the lunar lander separate from the spacecraft, land on the moon. The mission on the moon will begin, and then the spacecraft, the top part of it, would separate, go back into orbit and rendezvous and connect up with the main spacecraft, and then that would go back to the Earth. Well, the third method, lunar orbit rendezvous, actually was the one that was chosen for the mission, which meant that there was a competition to build a lunar lander. So NASA invited 11 firms to come up with ideas, and they picked one out of the 11, which was this little unassuming little model made by Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation. It's just it's the first lunar lander. This was it, and it's not much.
Well, it's a model
it's
of
a model,
their
yeah.
first model of what
Right.
it might be like, and
Yeah.
that was what was.
But basically it has an ascent stage, a docking port, a descent stage here, and then 5 little legs made out of paper clips. So anyway, so they built a proposal model, and then they had to basically go through different iterations, and because they found out the original proposal model was way too much. So they, in the next iteration, they got rid of 4 windows, which lessened the weight, made this little port smaller, so exit entry port instead of a docking port, and removed removed one of the legs, so it had 4 legs. And they've also refined it further by wrapping a material just around the parts that they needed. And finally, that was final model. They also removed seats inside the lunar module because they didn't really need seats in 0 gravity, the astronauts didn't. And even if they're on the moon, the astronauts experience 1/6 gravity, so that was another weight savings. For every pound of material on the spacecraft, you needed 4 pounds of fuel to add to it, so every pound really mattered. The ground testing involved astronauts going in and out of the lunar module, and we can see here originally they decided the astronauts would climb down on a little rope ladder, actually a ladder made of little knots in it. And that didn't really work, so they had to add a ladder back into the lunar module. And the round hatch became a square hatch to accommodate the life-supporting backpack, which was rectangular in shape. The engines, the engines were flight tested on a mission with Apollo 5, Lunar Module 1, and this is Lunar Module 3 prepared for its flight in March of 1969.
Now, originally, Lunar Module 3 was supposed to fly in December of 1968 and on Apollo 8. And this is a crazy story because just prior to that, as they're getting ready in August of 1968 and preparing for the December mission of Apollo 8 that was supposed to test the lander, they learned that there were leaks galore, 100 leaks in the lunar module. It was not ready. It was not ready to fly. It had lots and lots of problems. So at that point, the NASA controller said, okay, well, we can't fly in the lunar module in December. Let's just send the guys to the moon. We'll do. So the Apollo 8 mission got bumped up. They weren't supposed to send people to the moon, but the LEM wasn't ready. So they sent people to the moon in December 1968 and pushed the lunar module testing mission to this one, Apollo 9, in March of 1969. So altogether, it was a huge number of people working just on the lunar module. It took 7 years. David's going to reference this a little bit later in his talk, but that's the lead up to the actual launch of Apollo 9. So these are the astronauts. They are Commander McDivitt, pilot Dave Scott, and Rusty Schweickart, who was the rookie. McDivitt and Scott had flown before, but Schweickart had not. They flew in this. This is the command module and service module. So basically going to the moon, you had the command module, the service, that's the command module, the service module with all the stuff that made it fly, and the LEM. Those were the three parts that went to the moon. LEM comes off, goes down to the surface, back up, and it all flies back to Earth. But we had to test. Before doing that at the moon, we wanted to test it on Earth orbit. So it was just nearby. So Apollo 9 did not go to the moon. I've taken your line. Oh, no. It didn't go to Apollo to the moon. It did, but it tested the LEM in Earth orbit.
Yeah, and also the blue covering on the capsule reminded the astronauts of a gumdrop candy, so they named it Gumdrop. And guess what they called this one? It looked kind of like something with 8 legs instead of 4, but Spider. So it was Gumdrop and Spider. Anyway, here's the launch, getting ready for the launch, which happened 50 years ago today of Apollo 9. This is the Saturn V rocket, the 3-stage, 363-foot tall rocket that's almost as tall as our city hall in Los Angeles, if you can imagine that.
And here are the astronauts getting ready, heading in. They were strapped in and launched. And here they are on orbit. Who have we got here, Tony?
Rusty Schweickart and Jim McDivitt.
Great.
And there's a picture of them in the lunar module when they were testing it.
So.
Okay, so first order of business once they got into space was to extract the lunar module from the top stage of the Saturn V. And so they maneuvered around and approached it and put the nose of the command module into the top of the lunar module and into this docking adapter and pulled the lunar module out of the Saturn V stage. Here's the docking target.
How many of you follow the SpaceX program, SpaceX launch program? Oh, well, one was launched yesterday, and this morning SpaceX docked, and it has a very similar port like that, docked a capsule that is capable of carrying crew members up to the International Space Station. We've been flying on the Soyuz all along, and now SpaceX has shown this. So anyway, it's just kind of a neat, today actually is a very important day in space history because this morning they docked the SpaceX crew capsule with the International Space Station. But anyway, back to Apollo 9.
So after they pulled the lunar module out, they, using remote control of the computer on board their spacecraft, got the S4B, the upper stage of the Saturn V, to launch again, to start again, and they blasted it away from the Earth. You can see in the next picture, it's going off into space where it actually still is. It orbits the sun every 325 days now. Now, the astronauts got in the lunar module and practiced firing the engines of the command module just as if they were blasting around the moon. So they had to see how it worked all hooked together. It hadn't been done before. After that, though, there were problems. Rusty Schweickart, who hadn't been in space before, although it turns out that probably wasn't a factor, all of a sudden, in the middle of getting the lunar module in order, just lost all of his food, threw up, okay, and rather violently, and it didn't go away. It just kept getting worse and worse for that day. Now we know that like half of everybody who goes into space, like on the space station, throws up when they first, the first day.
So how many days was he sick?
He was sick one day.
And did it threaten the mission?
Yes, it did, because without him being able to be in good health, he couldn't fly the lunar module, and that's what he'd been trained for. Actually, he had been trained to fly on Apollo 8, which was supposed to have a lunar module. They swapped crews because the original Apollo 9 crew didn't, they weren't that far in their training. They thought it was easier to send those guys to the moon without a lunar module. These chose to not go to the moon and actually do this test flight. But
so he was critical to this.
He was critical, and without him in good order, they actually would probably fail the mission, because a lot of the things that had to be done required him up and running. Well, it turns out the next day when they were checking out things, he started joking. Commander Scott noticed that he seemed to be in good health, and he said, "Do you want to do it?" And he said, "Yeah, let's do it." And he didn't get sick anymore after that. So the first thing they did was Scott looked out of the command module and made films, while Schweickart, in the next image here, had the Apollo moon suit, the one that they'd actually walk on the moon with, in the backpack and everything for the first time in space, making sure it worked. And so it worked beautifully, and they spent a long time doing this outside for over an hour.
So I always like to remember that this is 4 months before we landed people on the moon. We hadn't maneuvered the command module, we hadn't tested the LEM, we hadn't tested the spacesuit. All of these things were absolutely critical to getting people safely on the moon. And we had this challenge given by John F. Kennedy in the beginning of the decade that we had to get it done by the end of the decade. So we're running out of time. Things were each one of these tests was critical.
That's right. So here, a couple days later, they actually took the lunar module out. They ended up going 100 miles away from the command module. But the first time flying a lunar module and testing all its controls, even determining what more could be cut off it, because even this lunar module is still too heavy to land on the moon. And that would keep going on for a couple more flights. But here we see checkout. Yes, they get ready to fly 100 miles out. And meanwhile, back in the lunar module, they look back at the command module. And, well, this is later. This is afterwards. They fly back, but not the whole thing. Remember, the whole idea of getting the lunar module down to size was only the part you need would come back. So the Ascent stage, the part that would carry astronauts back from the moon, was blasted off from the descent stage, the part that in future flights would be left on the moon, and they rendezvoused back with the command module and got back in to get ready for their return to Earth. And I think the next picture shows these craft in space. And here's the returning Ascent stage, just the upper part of that lunar module. And finally, the astronauts filmed their own return, plunging back through the atmosphere at about 17,000 miles per hour, 7,000 miles per hour slower than they would be coming back from the moon. But nevertheless, scorching ride, and riding the parachutes down, and finally getting picked up in the Atlantic Ocean by an aircraft carrier. And here's the happy crew having a successful flight and paving the way for Apollo 10.
So, I think it all looks fake.
Yeah, well, especially since you told us they didn't go to the moon.
Right,
So,
exactly.
but Apollo 8 did. But we can show them how we did it. This is how it was done. Do I get this control? So anyway, a lot of people think we faked it with lines attached to the astronauts as they bounced around, Doge directing it all. But why do people think these things when we built all this equipment? We had engineers designing stuff, building it. They had the specifications that it would work in space, that it would land on the moon. Apollo 9, they tested this stuff and they broadcast the testing, they filmed the testing, you could watch it happen. They had to fake all those monitors, all these engineers, all these people monitoring the systems, each had different displays showing different parts of the spacecraft. So all that stuff had to be faked as well because each of these people thought they were going to the moon. We launched real hardware, so they had to build the actual hardware even if they were faking it because stuff went up into space. Amateurs were able to photograph that hardware doing stuff. The stuff it was doing were the steps that would have been needed to go to the moon. So you had to fake the steps by sending real stuff to the moon.
So what are we looking at here?
What you're looking at is the stage separations here. So this is when the second, or not the stage, when they ignite the upper stage to fire it on its way to go to the moon. So when you're orbiting the Earth, you need to fire a rocket engine again that sends it off to the moon. So this is actually the rocket engine firing to send that spacecraft to the moon on the right trajectory. And these are amateurs with telescopes on Earth, not paid by NASA, that are seeing the expected stuff in space. The hardware had panels that would have blown off like this as the command module was separated from the upper stage. And that was photographed, again, by amateurs. So you can see those 4 panels. Those streaks going by are stars. They took photographs of what looked like the moon, but if these were just sets, they had to build all these sets. This one has kind of a flat background with a crater. This one they had to paint mountains in the background, and they had to haul all this gray dirt. And in this one, they had to dig a big pit, in addition to painting different mountains and different colors of gray dirt. It makes me wonder where the truck drivers that brought all the gray dirt to all these sets, what did they do with it if all this stuff was faked, because they had to do a lot. People want to know why there aren't stars in this picture. I don't see any stars here. Oh, they forgot to put them in. They remembered to get the right color of gray, but they forgot the stars. Well, the answer is cameras simply can't photograph really faint things and really bright things at the same time. Here's a shot I took at Griffith Observatory, and you can see the door over here. It's really dark. You can't see anything, but the clouds in the sky, they look pretty good. Now, as I increase the exposure time, all of a sudden I start to see detail. Oh, the door's still pretty dark, but I'm beginning to see the dome. Clouds are getting a little washed out. And now I increase the exposure time even more. Now I can see detail in that door to our planetarium and on the roof, but everything else is really overexposed. So you can choose, do I want to see bright stuff or faint stuff? So this is the famous Earthrise picture from Apollo 8. No stars in the photograph, but the lunar surface and the Earth are properly exposed. They look good. We can take a look. So simulation of it. As you're collecting light from the moon and the Earth, if you get those correctly, you don't see stars. But if you do see the stars, you've overfilled the Earth and the moon. They're overexposed, so you can't get both. You don't go all the way to the moon to take pictures of the stars. You can do that from Earth. You go to the moon to get this picture that you can't get from the Earth. On the moon, people say, well, shadows are going different directions. This is indicating they had different light sources. So these shadows up here are going that way. These shadows look like they're going that direction. How can this be? They had multiple spotlights. It's just fake. Well, here's a shot I took coming up to Griffith Observatory. Those shadows are going different directions, apparently. This is called perspective. It was figured out in the Renaissance by the painters. Suddenly, paintings got much more realistic because they realized that this is just how the universe works when you do this. Here's another shot of shadows going different directions. This also has to do with relief. There's a little bit of a slope here, and if you have shadows going on slopes, they also do kind of weird things. So on the moon, you had shadows going different directions, both because of relief, you have pits and holes, and you also have perspective going on, just what happens. This is an instrument, this blocky thing here, that actually bounces light back exactly the direction that it came from. So if you shoot a laser beam from Earth, hit that instrument, the laser beam is going to bounce exactly back where it came from and be able to be detected back on Earth. We can do this. It's how we measure the distance to the Earth. We know how fast light goes, so you just measure the difference in time. However, if you don't point right where we say we landed, you don't get a return signal. So to fake this, we had to send robots that delivered this equipment in order to pretend that we went there. So already to fake the moon landings, we actually had to send things to the moon. So you're already going there. Why not just send people at this point? We brought back moon rocks, or at least purportedly we did. Well, the Soviets did bring back moon rocks using robots. They match our moon rocks. The Soviets never came forward and say, their moon rocks are faked, ours are real. No, and they would want to prove it being false. It was a political game. It was who could win by getting to the moon first. If they could say we faked it, that would be a big political victory for them. Also, moon rocks have these little tiny craters in them, like the right-hand side. Micrometeorites, little grains of sand flying through space very fast. They burn up in our atmosphere as shooting stars. On the moon, they make it all the way to the surface, and they make little tiny impacts in rocks. So these are seen all over the place. You don't see those in Earth rocks. Also, these little glass spheres, they get produced in big impacts that melt the silicon, make little glass beads. Well, these are all over the place on the moon, all those impacts you see, all the craters. On Earth, we do see them around very fresh impacts, and we can make them, but they erode very quickly. They're so small, the process of erosion just weathers them away. So we don't see them very much on Earth, yet they're everywhere on the moon. And this one even has a little impact on it that you can see there. It was a glass sphere created, but then a little piece of sand smacked into it. We sent a telescope to the moon to photograph the moon to research it further, called Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, Mars. There is an MRO, but Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. And it has a 12-inch telescope on it. That's the equivalent of a telescope a mile wide in Earth orbit. And it can get these sort of pictures. You can see the landing sites and the tracks around them. Here's another one, probably the best one they've gotten. You can see tracks the astronauts left behind, trails from the rover. We'll label the objects here. That's the Challenger descent stage down there. The ALSEP is some of the equipment they left. You can see the lunar rover. Maybe all this was fake, but the Japanese have a spacecraft that they took pictures of the ground as well. They don't get this sort of detail, but they can tell it was disturbed. So you can go to their websites and see those pictures, but maybe they're in and on it as well. A lot of people say, well, why haven't we gone back? They faked it, and that's proof we haven't gone because we haven't been there recently. Well, this is NASA's budget as a percentage of the total federal budget. You can see late 50s, it was very small, and then they ballooned the budget up over 4% as Apollo was as we're building everything. You need all the money to do it. As we're carrying out the program, the budget starts to drop a little bit until finally Apollo is closed, we finish it, and throughout the late 70s, the budget was under 1%. And all of a sudden, over this period of time, we build a space shuttle, we build a space station. Those are expensive. You can't go to the moon and be doing these other things at the same time. So it's political will and money. If you have the political will, then you put enough money in it to make sure it happens. So the reason we haven't gone back is just it's a matter of funds and priorities. There's other things we wanted to do. We built the Hubble Space Telescope. We've sent missions to every single planet and dwarf planets, many of the dwarf planets. So NASA is doing a lot. Going to the moon wasn't a priority. But I do believe we went. We really did leave boot prints on the moon, and it was quite an achievement.
And with all of those, close to 500,000 people involved.
Yeah.
How are you going to make sure that all of those people keep the secret, right? That's not going to happen. Someone, at least one person, is going to go for the money from the National Enquirer to get, to spill the beans that the whole thing was faked. So,
yeah. And meanwhile, others think that everybody else is still being paid to tell the lie.
yeah.
So where are the funds coming from to perpetuate the falsehoods that we went to the moon? The budget's not there. It would be cheaper just to go.
So I'm sure all of you people know that, but I bet you've met people who believe they were faked, and we hope we've given you a little ammunition to be able to go out and share that and convince others that it really happened, because all of those people, and especially those brave astronauts who put their lives on the line to go do this, deserve to get the recognition and honor that for their amazing achievement, and to just say the whole thing was faked. Well, that's why Buzz Aldrin punched the guy in the face, right? Because it's such an insult. So we will, as I said before, continue to go forward and celebrate the anniversaries of each of these missions. And we hope that you will come back to Griffith Observatory and enjoy them. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for coming this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day at Griffith Observatory.